Have a quorum. This meeting of the Working Group of Committee Chairpersons is now in public session. I have apologies received from Deputy Maria Bailey, Brendan Smith, Michael Healy-Rae. I'd just like to do the usual reminder to members on the mobile phones, please, if you can, switch them off or set them to airplane mode to avoid interference. May I start, obviously, the meeting by welcoming the Taoiseach for the second engagement with the Working Group of Committee Chairs. We're delighted to have you here again, Taoiseach. The committees undertake detailed work which does not lend committees obviously undertake detailed work which does not lend itself to consideration in plenary chambers. The committee chairs present also know that while our work is intensive, our collective remit is extensive and our approach enables Parliament to engage with citizens in a more meaningful and direct manner. In 2018, actually, there are 626 committee meetings involving 2,179 witnesses overall. So it's a level of direct engagement with citizens, and nature and depth of our work on policy matters are among several aspects of the committee's work, which makes it particularly rewarding and beneficial. I hope, obviously, that once again this engagement will be a mutual benefit to my fellow chairpersons on policy matters and priorities for our Oireachtas committees and the government. Just again, the mobile phone reminder, and propose that we now proceed directly to the substantive part of today's meeting, which is first of all to ask you, Taoiseach, to make your opening statement.
Good afternoon, and thanks very much, Chairman. Accompanying me is the Secretary General of my department, Martin Fraser. In the programme for government, we wanted to strengthen accountability through attendance at Oireachtas committees, and I welcome this opportunity to hear your issues of concern and to discuss the government's response to them. For that reason, I'll keep my opening statement relatively short. Since the current government, made up of Fine Gael and independent ministers, came to office, 113 Acts of the Oireachtas have been passed. 9 of these were originally published as private members' bills. A further 23 government bills are currently before the Dáil and 10 before the Seanad. We hope to have as many of these as possible concluded by the summer recess. All of this work benefits from the input of your committees, and I want to recognise your contribution as chairs and the members of your committees in scrutinising relevant legislation, dissecting the work of our agencies and advising on public policy. I know this is our second meeting in this format, and it's an opportunity to reflect on where we are as a country and how we're doing in the round. Today, as a country, we're nearing full employment. We have a record 2.3 million people at work and the lowest unemployment rate now in 14 years. The economy is doing well and is being managed well, and as a result of that, incomes and living standards are rising, poverty and deprivation rates are falling and have been for 4 years now, including a 30% reduction in child poverty. We've balanced the books, moved into surplus, and we're reducing our national debt, and we'll make our first deposit into the Rainy Day Fund later this year. However, we cannot be complacent. We've been here before as a country, and we're mindful of the risks to our economic welfare, none more so than the threat posed by Brexit. Regardless of the form that it takes, Brexit will have an adverse impact on Ireland and requires planning by government, business and citizens, as well as at EU level. Given what's happening in London and the risk of a no-deal Brexit, given what happening in London, the risk of a no-deal Brexit continues to be a significant possibility, and if anything, it's an increasing one as every day goes by. We'll stay vigilant and will continue to work for the best possible outcome while preparing for all possibilities. A detailed contingency plan published on the 19th of December and updated in January set out the government's analysis of a no-deal Brexit, and the Brexit Omnibus Act was signed into law by the President last St Patrick's Day. This primary legislation crosses the remit of 9 government ministers, comprises 15 parts to help prepare Ireland for no deal. It focuses on protecting our citizens, helping business, securing jobs and ongoing access to essential public services and products. On the 8th of May, Ireland and the UK signed a Memorandum of Understanding on the Common Travel Area. This reaffirms our shared commitment to maintaining the Common Travel Area in all circumstances. Irish and British citizens will continue to be able to move freely, to live, work, study, access welfare, pensions and public services in each other's countries on a reciprocal basis. They'll also be able to vote in national and parliamentary elections in the UK on the same basis as British citizens, while British citizens will be able to do the same in Ireland. At home, we're investing for the future. With Project Ireland 2040, we're making massive investments in our public infrastructure, such as housing, transport, culture, sport, education and healthcare in all parts of the country. At its core, Project Ireland 2040 is about balanced regional development, planning for a country with a population of 6 million people by the middle of this century, if not before. So we need to develop Cork, Waterford, Limerick and Galway into cities of real scale, growing twice as fast as the capital. And we need to develop other major urban centres, such as Sligo, Athlone, Dundalk and Drogheda along the M1 corridor, and Letterkenny and Derry. We're also planning for a rural Ireland which continues to experience population and jobs growth, with vibrant towns and villages at its core. We expect the population of rural Ireland to increase by 200,000 by 2040. The shovels are in the ground and Project Ireland 20 is now being implemented. While understandably there's been a lot of focus on one particular hospital, there are now 3 new hospitals under construction, one which will be complete very soon in Portrane, the new National Forensic and Mental Health Hospital. Extensions are happening all over the country, including new wings or new ward blocks in Limerick, Waterford and Clonmel, to name just 3. The new runway at Dublin Airport is now under construction, and the first technological university has been established. An ambitious programme of school buildings in every county, major new road projects in the North West and South East, including the N4 to Sligo, the design contract for the M20. The M7 upgrade and Escortia new Ross bypasses will open later this year, with Dunkettle, Ballyvoyne and Macroom moving to construction. Project Ireland 2040 will enable every part of the country to grow and share in our national prosperity. The first allocations have also been made from the 4 project funds. 84 projects have been awarded some 86 million under the Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, 88 receiving about 100 million under the Urban Regeneration and Development Fund. 75 was awarded to 27 projects through the Disruptive Technologies Innovation Fund, and 77 awarded 7 projects in the first phase of the Climate Action Fund. We're also preparing for the world of the future with Future Jobs Ireland. We all know that in the next decades, AI, VR and AR, robotics and automated vehicles will change our world as much as the internet and mobile phones have in the recent past. We need to be ready to benefit from the new jobs and the new wealth that will be created. If we're to have the kind of economy and society that I believe we all want in 2025, low carbon, high productivity, high tech, family friendly, globally traded and competitive, we need to create the environment where that is possible now. Every generation needs to shake up its enterprise and jobs model, otherwise it stagnates. So we're working to change the way that we work. Education, of course, is central to that. So for 2019, we've allocated 10.8 billion to the Department of Education. This is the highest in our history. It's a big number, so what does it mean in practical terms? 5,000 extra teachers hired in 2 years, the lowest pupil-teacher ratio in our primary schools ever. 1.8 billion there to assist children with special educational needs, more SNAs than ever before, and new subjects like PE and computer science. More people attending higher education from non-traditional backgrounds, and new school buildings, extensions and refurbishments all over the country. By the end of this year, we'll have added 40,000 extra replacement school places, built 200 modern science labs, and 48 new or upgraded PE halls, and we've replaced 600 prefabs. Construction is now also well underway on new facilities at Grange Gorman for TU Dublin, and I'm very keen to see a new TU created next in the South East, in Munster or in both. Delivery of the National Broadband Plan represents a significant intervention by government in promoting rural development. A digital divide exists between urban and rural Ireland, and that contributes to an economic and social divide. We can close it now, or we never will. The plan aims to ensure that every home, school, business in Ireland has access to high-speed broadband, almost all by fibre. And earlier this month we approved the appointment of a preferred bidder. National Broadband Ireland, the preferred bidder, will supply broadband to 1/4 of Irish people, premises that currently cannot access high-speed broadband. It guarantees a level playing field for 1.1 million people, 500,000 homes, 100,000 businesses and farms, and 600 schools, getting the same speeds for roughly the same price. Despite some real progress made to date, I'm fully aware that very many problems persist. For example, in the areas of housing and homelessness, healthcare and climate change. Last year, 18,000 new homes were built in Ireland. That's the highest in a decade. And we know from figures released by the CSO in recent days that new home building is up another 25% this year so far. So we'll certainly see between 22,000 and 25,000 new homes being built in Ireland this year. This doesn't include student accommodation or vacant homes being brought back into use. The construction industry and the social housing programme are being rebuilt bit by bit. Last year, for example, 8,500 new homes were added to the social housing stock, which is a very significant number. About half of those were built by councils or housing trusts, and the other half were acquired from developers, leased or brought back into use having been vacant. But we need to go higher than that again. So we're aiming for 10,000 this year and 11 or 12,000 the year after that. This is the largest social housing programme we've had in the state for decades, but there are constraints and limitations, such as the availability of construction workers, delays in planning, tendering and construction. This and nothing else is holding us back from accelerating the social housing programme further. In fact, the housing budget this year is 2.6 billion, the biggest budget for housing ever, and it'll rise again in 2020. We're also spending 146 million on homelessness services this year. It's making a difference. Last year, over 5,000 adults and their dependents exited homelessness. So more people are being lifted out of homelessness than ever before. Unfortunately, though, we've yet to stem the tide of people becoming homeless for the first time, or in sometimes a second time. In order to ensure a long-term supply of affordable rental homes in our cities, a different form of not-for-profit rental is required. This is cost rental. There are currently 2 cost rental projects being piloted at Enniskerry Road in South Dublin and Emmett Road in Inchicore. Cumulatively, these 2 projects will provide 380 cost rental homes, and if it works, it's a model we can scale up across the state. In healthcare this year, we'll see the highest ever level of funding in the history of the state, about 17 billion. We also have a €10 billion capital programme over the next 10 years to renew our buildings, our equipment, our ICT. As I mentioned, we have 3 hospitals under construction. A 4th is on the way, with the National Maternity Hospital due to go to tender later this year. While there has been understandable focus on the National Children's Hospital, it's worthwhile pointing out once again that it will take up less than 20% of the capital budget for health, leaving 80% for other projects all over Ireland. For example, this year, 11 new primary care centres will open, added to the 125 that are already operational. We've reversed the previous government's policy on reducing hospital bed capacity. We did that back in 2014. While it's been a slow process, by the end of this year, the number of hospital beds will be back above 11,000 for the first time in 10 years. And while too high, the trolley count this year so far is lower than last. Waiting times for operations and procedures like cataracts, tonsillectomies, hips and knee replacement and angiograms and scopes are down about half since the middle of 2017. The Seán Care implementation team is up and running. This, as we know, is a 10-year all-party vision to introduce universal healthcare in Ireland, free or affordable healthcare for all, much speedier access to healthcare and a decisive shift towards prevention, primary care and community care, with much greater local and regional autonomy. Following an open competition, Paul Reid has taken up his role as Director General of the HSE. A new HSE board is being established to strengthen management, governance and accountability. An agreement has also been reached with the IMO on a major package of GP contractual reforms that will benefit patients, make general practice a more attractive career option for doctors, and help bring about positive changes at primary care level. It represents a 40% increase in funding for general practice over 3 to 4 years. A new contract has also been agreed with staff nurses and midwives. It now needs to be implemented. As we know, climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing humanity today. So the Government warmly welcomes the report of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action published in March. The committee worked constructively over the last few months to achieve a broad consensus on what needs to be done. The recommendations have informed the Government's climate plan, which is being finalised by Minister Bruton, and it will align with other work we're doing to build a strong economy, a society in which nobody feels left out, one that has a family at its centre, with modern infrastructure, in a country sure of its place in the world. The plan will set out how we intend to enable Ireland to meet our climate targets, and will set out a range of actions in energy, agriculture, transport and buildings, as well as other sectors. While it doesn't often go commented on, Ireland already performs well in some areas, such as recycling, exceeding our EU targets, and we're now up to 30% renewable power. And we can do well on greenhouse gas emissions as well. In our National Development Plan, we're investing about 21.8 billion over the next 10 years, some exchequer but mainly through the semi-states. This will bring renewable energy from 30% today to 70% by 2030. The installation of electric vehicle infrastructure led by the ESB, building insulation, the electrification of some more of our railways. Indeed, just this week, Irish Rail began procurement of 600 new electric and hybrid locomotives. There are more buses, and the first low emissions ones went into service in Dublin this month. No high emission buses will be purchased for our cities henceforth. In relation to justice reform, the third report of the Effectiveness and Renewal Group was published back in February. It shows substantial progress that has been made throughout this transformation. We're working to implement the report of the Commission on the Future of Policing in 5 areas: leadership and accountability, people, structures and operations, independent oversight and partnerships. We'll strengthen the human rights compliant culture within the Gardaí, develop a new digital strategy, review Garda discipline, and continue workforce modernisation and civilianisation. We also want to improve the working conditions of Garda personnel through the deployment of ICT to reduce paperwork and by resolving long-standing issues such as rostering, the uniform and wellness. Colleagues, this is just a small section of some of the work that government is doing. I believe we're on track, but there is much more to do. Chairman, your Oireachtas committees perform a significant role in our parliamentary democracy and a very much enhanced role in this stall. They help us deal with some of the biggest challenges faced by our country. I look forward to hearing your questions and engaging with you on the priorities of your respective committees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Now, just before we go into the next part of our meeting, I'm just going to do a quick recap on what are the agreed procedures for the meeting. So basically, we will be taking questions in groups of 3 chairs that will operate under the D'Hunt sequence. There will be an opportunity for 1 minute to ask the question. The Taoiseach will then have a reply time to that, approximately 4 minutes, and then there will be a second subsequent round of 1 minute questions again to the Taoiseach with the same reply time. The sequence of chairs and the questions being asked have been distributed to you. You should have a copy there. In the event that somebody is not present, I will just be moving up from the group below, so we could get to people earlier than is indicated. So with that, I'm going to go to our first group of chairpersons in terms of questions. So, Deputy Fleming.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Thank you for being here. And a lot of what you've referred to are issues that I wanted to raise with you. I want to make 1 or 2 positive suggestions. One is really in relation to Project Ireland 2040, which has a capital expenditure plan of 140 billion. I believe the level of the national debt was so severe a few years ago, we set up a National Treasury Management Agency. I believe you should now set up a National Capital Projects Agency to handle all the big projects and get expertise and expert in one agency, a bit like the NTMA, to manage projects, for example, over 20 million. And I say that because let the schools, they can progress at the level they're doing already. And I think it's not, as the PAC chair I'm saying, we've had mistakes in the Children's Hospital, we might have mistakes in the broadband issue, and there are more. And it's not a right way to run a major capital project to let every Secretary General be responsible for the capital investment in their own department, and each of them make their own individual mistakes and no overall learning capacity. So I would see tremendous merit in having one state agency, and it would build up tremendous expertise and knowledge in procurement, and above all it would free the line departments to do their main work. For example, and I'll conclude on this, you know, with the Children's Hospital, the Secretary General of the HSC and the head of the HSC and Secretary General of the Department and senior officials are spending a lot of their time dealing with a construction project. They should be dealing with the health issues.
Thank you, Deputy.
And I think that would free their time up if somebody else took over.
Thank you, Deputy Fleming. Deputy Harty.
Thank you very much, Sherlock. Thank you very much, Taoiseach, for attending this afternoon. As you quite correctly mentioned, Sláintecare as being a 10-year vision for change and reorientating our health service towards primary care. and spending public money for the public good, and concentrating on need and not the ability to pay. To implement the reform programme, Taoiseach, we need transitional funding to be allocated to reforming our health service, and in particular in information and communication technology, which is essential for underpinning the reform programme in gathering data and giving real-time information on how we can assess the reform programme as it rolls out. So will transitional funding be made available to Sláintecare in this year's budget, and when will multi-annual budgeting be adopted to allow for long-term planning and certainty in the reform programme?
Thank you. Deputy O'Caoláin.
Taoiseach, you referenced some of the work of the Justice and Equality Committee, primarily within the policing area. I wish to address some matters under the equality element of our responsibilities, and I want at the outset to commend your department on the initiative of engagement with the Oireachtas Disability Group, and I want to commend the work on your behalf by Philip O'Callaghan. So I want to record that at the first. I understand if you won't be able to give me the specifics in relation to these matters, but I'd ask you to note them, and if it's possible, even subsequently to write to me on it. The UNCRPD was ratified in March 2018. The optional protocol, the ratification of that is essential to the implementation of the hope and promise of the UNCRPD and the prospect of people with disabilities being able to secure access to their rights and needs. I'd ask, when will the optional protocol be ratified? In relation to the Disability Miscellaneous Provisions Bill, the report and final stage has yet not been scheduled. I'd ask if you would advise, please, when that will be done. Last 2 points. The in loco parentis rule needs to be repealed. Parents looking after seriously ill, seriously disabled children need to have that certainty. Please. Thank you.
Now, thank you. That completes our first group of questions. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, deputies. I think Deputy Fleming's suggestion is one worth considering. It is something we actually considered at the time of developing Project R in 2040 and decided not to go for it. There is a body like that in Australia called Infrastructure Australia, which is a government agency that is tasked with overseeing and driving all of their major infrastructure projects. So I think it's an idea that is worth dusting down and looking at again. But I would throw in there two caveats. The first, that the roads programme, the schools programme and the Irish Water programme are all happening on time and on budget. So, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So there are plenty of areas where capital projects are being delivered on time and on budget. And one of the things we decided to do when we went ahead with the National Children's Hospital, and I was the Minister of Health at the time, was to set up a dedicated agency and a dedicated board with expert staff to make sure that it was done properly. And I wonder now, if we'd gone the other road and allowed HSE estates to do the job, would the job be having done just as well, or even better? Because while the HSE comes in for a lot of criticism when it comes to the new hospitals and new wings and primary care centres, they do them pretty well. So it's not a bad idea, but I'm not sure if it's a panacea either. In relation to Deputy Harty's question on the transition fund, I suppose what we'd agree on is that in order to reform the health service, it's going to cost money, and that can't come out of the day-to-day spend, because that has to be spent anyway. And in the health service, you need to invest to spend, or spend to save, as some people say. I'd argue we have a transition fund already. We just don't tot it all up and call it a transition fund. So the €80 million a year that's set aside for investment in ICT is a transition fund. The capital budget, which is now about €700 million a year for new buildings, is transitional funding as well. The new money for general practice, particularly for the new treatments, the chronic disease funds, to me that is, all those things are transition. We just don't tot them up and say this is the Sláintecare Transitional Fund. Now we could do that, but is that just an accounting exercise? And then there's obviously the 20 million fund that people can bid for if they have particular ideas. So I would argue we have it already, we just don't tot it up that way and account for it that way, but maybe we should. Deputy O'Caoláin's questions, I will have to come back to him on them, and thanks for your kind words about Philip O'Callaghan. We do want to sign the optional protocol. We're not ready yet, and I'll come back to the disability miscellaneous bill. In local parentis rule, I was across that maybe 6 months or a year ago, and I'm not up to date on it now. But certainly I heard what Jack and Jill had to say in particular, and I've met constituents who've been affected by this, and you know, maybe it's one of those things that was done with the best intentions but hasn't passed the common sense test. So I'll make sure that we come back to the deputy on all three of those questions.
Okay, thank you, Taoiseach. And now for the follow-up round of questions. So again, it's a 1 minute time. Deputy Fleming.
Thank you. I'd just like to raise two other points in terms of public confidence and accountability in the spending of taxpayers' money. Another suggestion I would make is the Section 38 and 39 organisations, which you're very familiar with, having been the Minister for Health. They have expenditure of taxpayers' money of about 5 billion, and there is no public accountability because they're not directly accountable to the Oireachtas in any manner. And there should be a case that where these organisations receive the majority of their funding from the Irish taxpayer, there should be some public accountability back into the Oireachtas, and that has been an issue. And I think we need to make sure there's accountability there. And the other issue, the same with public-private partnerships. They talk about commercial sensitivity. Some of these contracts can run for 25 or 30 years, and you can't wait for 30 years to examine was it a good or a bad value for money. There needs to be a mechanism after a short period of time that there is public scrutiny in relation to some of these public-private partnerships that will happen during the course of Project Ireland 2040, and it will give greater public confidence into what's happening if they can see a bit of transparency.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Harty.
Thank you, Caoimhghín. Just to refer to one question I asked in my first round in relation to multi-annual budgeting in relation to the health service, which would allow it to have long-term planning and certainty. In many systems that have engaged in health reform, they have moved to multi-annual budgets to allow for a longer-term planning process. In returning to the procurement process and the procurement process for large infrastructural projects, which falls within the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and in relation to the National Children's Hospital, which has been the subject of many committee meetings at the Health Committee, the existing procurement process was a two-stage process, and it gave weighting to cost at 75% and quality at 25%, which put an emphasis on the cheapest bid rather than an emphasis on quality. So what plans do you have, Taoiseach, to review that style of procurement process?
Thank you. Deputy O'Caoláin.
Taoiseach, yes, I'm acknowledging as Chair of the Justice and Equality Committee and Vice Chair of the Oireachtas Disability Group that we have currently a working relationship between your department and the cross-party group, most importantly, in relation to disability issues. That's unprecedented. The matters that I have highlighted are of particular importance and concern to the non-governmental organisations sector. And I re-emphasise again, you referenced the in loco parentis being across it 6 months ago. Nothing has happened over the period since. I do appeal to you to look at that very, very seriously indeed. The matter of the optional protocol, I think it is imperative that we have that ratified, and the passage of the Disability Miscellaneous Provisions Bill that has completed committee stage and awaits report in final stage is a critical element in the ultimate delivery of the hope and promise of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And I thank you for your correspondence to follow. Thank you.
Thanks. Just picking up on Deputy Fleming's point, might be more of a question for me to you. Does the PSC not have any oversight over?
That's why rehab we're outside our remit, because once the HSE passes the money on, it's outside our remit. That's the issue. Okay.
I would have thought Section 38 at the very least should be.
Yeah, and so would I. Yeah.
And then maybe 39 instead of more than 50% funding.
Exactly. We're agreed on the principle anyway.
Okay. We are. On multi-annual budgeting, I think as a principle, multi-annual budgeting makes a lot of sense, and it's something I'd like to move to across government, not just for health. But again, there's this kind of a practical difficulty there. We actually do set out the budget for each department, not just for next year. We said, we publish this table regularly, and we'll publish it probably in the summer economic statement in a few weeks' time. How much each department is getting, not just this year, but also for the next 2 or 3 years. And they're called the expenditure ceilings. Now, they get adjusted at budget time, generally upwards, but we do actually set that out. And in health in particular, the extra money each year is factored in for demographics and for other pressures. Perhaps not adequately though, but it is there. The difficulty we have with health is the consistent inability to stay within the budget ceilings. And you can have any budget you like, multi-annual or annual or half-annual. If you're not able to stick within your budget ceilings, it's not of much value. And the temptation in the multi-annual budget system is to always take money from next year. So it can actually make that problem worse, potentially. On procurement, there's a few things that we're proposing to change when it comes to procurement. One may sound like an obvious one, but it is a serious one, and that is that we shouldn't proceed with a project until we know the full cost. Now that sounds blindingly obvious, of course. You shouldn't proceed with a project until you know the full cost. But that actually can give rise to difficulties. So for example, I'm a big supporter of projects like the M20 to link Cork and Limerick, and I'm a big fan of projects like Metrolink for Dublin. But you don't ever actually know the full cost of anything until you go to market, until you go to tender. And that's true whether you're building a small house or whether you're building a massive project. And enforcing that new policy will be difficult, because we may find ourselves at some point where we spend 30 or 40 million euros getting to the point of tender. Then we find out the real cost, and then we have to decide that we're not going ahead with it after all, and then justify how we spent 30 or 40 million on a project that didn't proceed. Now, it's happened before. Thornton Hall is an example under a previous administration. There are other examples, but it's not a perfect solution either. The other thing is looking again at the balance between cost and non-cost when it comes to how you weight a tender. But part of the advice that we would have from our legal people and experts in the field is that you're much more likely to face a legal challenge if you don't go for the lowest cost tender. And there have been challenges where we haven't given the lowest cost, we haven't given the tender to the lowest bidder. So that's a risk. It can delay projects. And it's not the case that it's cost and quality. They have to reach a minimum level of quality standards first, and then it's cost and non-cost factors. And you just run the risk, and it's a real risk, that if you don't go for the cheapest tender, then you could find yourself challenged. But it's a risk that we should just face, but it is a risk, and we need to bear that in mind. But the one thing I'd really like to change, and I have the attorney looking at this for me, and I don't accept that it can't be done under European procurement law, even though that's what some people say, is to have some sort of weighting around past form. And I'm not referring to any one company, because I don't mean any one company. There's several of them in several fields that haven't done a good job in the past, and I don't like to see them getting public contracts again. If you were going for a job in any of our offices, you'd look at people's references. Any normal person goes for a job anywhere. They give their references, and you ring up their former employers and you ask them, were they happy? Isn't that a kind of obvious thing that we should have in our public procurement process? Some sort of star rating based on those contractors' past form and performance when it came to other public contracts.
Right. Thank you, Taoiseach.
I know it was just a reiteration of the earlier points. Can you reconfirm, Taoiseach, your intent to come back to me on the points raised?
Absolutely.
Good.
Thank you. We're now going to proceed to our next group, and for the purposes of just letting that group will now consist of Deputy Casey, O'Loughlin and Deering. So first there is Deputy Casey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Taoiseach. My question is not a priority for the Housing Committee, but it's probably a topical question in light of last week's events. At a recent committee meeting, we had a detailed discussion on the importance of political research and the reasons behind voting, why people vote, and on that basis. But one of the key things was the political scientists had committed funding from 2002 to 2007, which gave quite significant information on why people voted, different reasons of, their political views, their political values, why people didn't vote or did not or vote. But since then, they've only been receiving money on an ad hoc basis and can carry out the same level of detail in relation to their research work. And I suppose the question to us at the time was twofold. One was the establishment of the Electoral Commission. When will it happen? And in the absence of that, is there any possibility of securing defined funding on an annual basis to allow them get ready for elections and be ready to try and get the research information that I think is vital for the Oireachtas moving forward?
Thank you. Deputy O'Loughlin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Taoiseach. You paint a very rosy picture of education, but that is not so really on the ground. So there's just a few quick points that I'm going to address. Firstly, the whole notion of the whole school community, and as well as parity of pay for teachers, I think it's really important that the heartbeat of the school, the secretaries and the caretakers, are treated equally. At the moment, we know that they're on poor pay and they have uncertain short-term contracts. They're not deemed to be public servants, and this certainly needs to be looked at and examined, along as well as the revised contracts for the SNAs. I also just want to mention education inequality and disadvantage, and this is really in terms of trying to raise the playing field at an education level for those who are vulnerable, and particularly those with special needs. So I want to ask you about the Epson Act, about when it's 15 years in situ, when it will be fully implemented, and also about the DESH scheme, because while that works for a lot of schools, there are a lot of disadvantaged children in non-DESH schools, and we need to have the extra funding there for homeschool liaison, for school meals, for school books and the extra programmes. Thank you, Taoiseach.
Thank you very much. And Deputy Deering.
Thank you, Chairman.
Welcome, Taoiseach, and apologies it was late coming in. You were in the middle of your presentation. My question from the Agriculture Committee is regards the future of the agriculture sector. It's obviously going to be going through challenges, huge challenges over the next number of years. And most likely with the exit of Great Britain from the Union, there's going to be a deficit in the next CAP. My question is basically around the CAP and what is being done presently in order to make sure that our European colleagues who have been very friendly in the past while, are they coming on side regard extra funding that may be required to meet that deficit? And what is the status of negotiations at the moment as regards that, and the rest of the negotiations as regards where we are going with CAP and the actual strategy around that? And can you also enlighten us, Taoiseach, when we may see the draft strategy for Ireland's strategic plan going forward for CAP over the next period of time?
Hey, thank you. Taoiseach.
Just on Deputy Casey's question about the political scientists, I'd have to check that one out. I'll have a chat with Minister Phelan about that. I don't see why we couldn't have some sort of dedicated fund, for that kind of research. You always run the risk of being accused that you're carrying out the research for the benefit of the government. I won't go over old ground in that regard. We had commissioned some research and decided not to go ahead with it, but maybe it's the way to do it. And I think definitely, given the very high number of spoiled ballots in these elections gone by, a bit of research into that I think would be beneficial, and also a bit of research into turnout. 50% turnout isn't bad for local and European elections, but I would be interested to know why the 50% that didn't turn out, and that would be very useful to have. And I'll speak to Mr. Phelan about whether that's something we can do. It doesn't in itself require establishing an electoral commission, although that would be the ideal vehicle for it. Like you, the research that I found most interesting on the day was the exit poll, which turned out to be wrong, beyond the margin of error on a lot of counts. And for the first day, I think Harty and a lot of the media reported the exit poll, not the election. I saw Saoirse McHugh, a really impressive young woman from Achill, who had been elected by Red Sea that morning, interviewed on RT all morning, and wasn't runner-up. One thing I think they do in Netherlands, which might be something for us to consider, is to require media outlets, when they report opinion polls, not to report the median but to report the range. So instead of saying that a party is at 32%, they should have to say the party is actually at between 29 and 31%. And that would be more accurate for a start, and would also, I think, be beneficial politically, but something we think we need to give some thought to, given that there is a margin of error in all of these things, and causes people to jump to conclusions, both media and politicians, that aren't actually based on the science. The Electoral Commission, we need to do it. It's long overdue. It's still a project that's in gestation, again under Minister Phelan's remit in the Customs House. Particularly, we have this bizarre situation where we're setting up referendum commissions all the time. Referendums have become a very frequent feature in Ireland, and we're forever setting them up and closing them down and finding a judge and finding offices. It's kind of crazy. And if we had a permanent electoral commission, so many of these things would be done much better around the register as well. One thing I remarked on as well, I had a good discussion with Nicola Sturgeon the other day when she was in town. They use STV for some of their elections, as we do. They don't use electronic voting, but they do use electronic counting. And they have machines that you just feed the ballot papers into, and they're glass and you can see what's going on, and they're able to count their votes in a matter of hours, whereas we could still be counting votes down in Cork City Hall in a few days' time. So while I would never go for electronic counting, maybe we need to think about electronic, or I would never go for electronic voting again. Maybe we should think about electronic counting, and perhaps we could borrow the machines from Scotland every now and then. Just on the question of education, I'm not sure if it's a rosy picture, Deputy, but I do think it's a good picture. If you look at our international statistics, our Irish children and students perform pretty well in reading and maths in so many different areas, and our teachers and our educators, I think, do a fabulous job. On school secretaries and caretakers, that's one of those long-standing issues that I would love to see resolved. But anything we do would have to be prospective. If they were to be taken on as employees, public sector employees into the future, it would have to be prospective. I don't think we could do anything retrospectively for lots of reasons. On Epsom, I'll have to come back to you about that, but it is about 15 years ago that legislation was passed, and I'd imagine large sections of it now are out of date and probably need to be updated in order to be implemented. The viewing aspect of the future of agriculture, and I think crucial to that is the new CAP, or the next CAP in the next 5-year multi-financial framework. Something I keep a close eye on, because it's Ireland's a net contributor to the EU budget, but most of the money that we get back is through CAP, and we want that to continue. And I'm lobbying very hard in building alliances with France, Spain, countries in Eastern Europe in particular, to try to defend the budget for CAP and make sure that it's the same, if not more, but ideally the same as it has been in the past. And that's going to be a real priority for us as we head into the talks on the MFF, which is Europe's next 5-year budget. I think the best way to achieve that is actually to make it part of environmental policy, and to green the CAP, and to make it a common agricultural and environment policy. And I'm not a farmer, as you know, but I've been interested in farming, and I was reading all about the detail of the GLAS scheme the other day. And a lot of people don't know this, that there are 60,000 farmers now in Ireland who are beneficiaries of the GLAS scheme. And part of what they do under that is plant trees, oak and ash, native trees. They provide wild bird cover, for example. They're already doing a lot of things that make a lot of sense, and maybe that should be mainstreamed as part of CAP, that all farmers, or a greater number of farmers, should be part of GLAS. And if we want to get more money for farmers and for CAP, it's in that space, I think, that we can get it. And the other area is perhaps for transition. If there are farmers that want to move from some forms of farming to other forms of farming that might be more environmentally sustainable, they'd have to be incentivised to do that, and it would have to be voluntary. But if we're looking to boost the budget, so there's more money for farmers, more money for the rural economy, the best way and the right way to do that, I think, is to make it an environmental policy as well as a food policy.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Casey, your second question.
Yeah, thank you, Ciarán, and thank the Taoiseach for his answers there. And maybe the other thing we might add into the research is particularly in relation to your own party, is I had to scrutinise a number of ballot papers over the weekend, and Andrew Doyle was getting the number 1, while Shay Cullen and Irene Winters were getting the numbers 2 and 3, and I think they lost out by 50 or 60 votes. So maybe you could look into that from your own party's point of view. Andrew Doyle was getting the number 1, and Councillor Cullen and Councillor Winters were getting the 2s and 3s. But just in relation to the European to the local paper, so it did come up quite a lot actually. That spoiled votes because of that. But a priority, I suppose, of the Housing Committee Taoiseach is housing, and I suppose it's disappointing again this week that we realise that the homeless figures have gone up again. So we're 3 years into the government, and we're 3 years into a continual rise in homelessness. And while it's a government responsibility, it is a blight on all of us here in the Oireachtas that this is the case, that we've now over 10,300 people homeless in Ireland, and nearly 3,800 of them are actually children. So can the Taoiseach give us any indication when he believes that that trend will start to reverse and won't continue on an upward trajectory? Thank you.
Deputy O'Loughlin.
Thank you. Taoiseach, I agree with you in relation to the Epson Act. I do think some of it's outdated. I think it's appalling that it hasn't been implemented within 15 years, but we absolutely do need to look at it again, so I would ask you to make that a priority, because without a shadow of a doubt, along with that, we need to have earlier and timelier assessments of children who need that extra support and who need that early intervention. We also need a range of supports within schools. The CAM system, which is within the Department of Health, but obviously has big implication within education, is an area that needs more intervention. And the last thing that I would ask, you mentioned about the capital spend and capital buildings, and I think that there's far too often a longer delay than should be in terms of announcement and in terms of school opening. And I'll just ever have to lose an opportunity here in terms of mentioning specifics, but I would mention the new secondary school in Kildare South, which was announced last year, but we're still looking at sites, but there just hasn't been any movement on it. St Paul's Monastravan, which is waiting 15 years. At the moment, there's 207 boys. 207 boys sharing 2 pupils. And Closh to Easagon and Portarlington.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Deering.
Thank you, Chairperson. One of the good news stories, both from an agricultural perspective, in the last number of weeks, the compensation package that was announced from Europe about 2 weeks ago. Could the Taoiseach kind of remind us about when that money funding may be matched? There was a commitment of another 50 million from the state coffers as such, and when is the potential allocation dates for that money, and how will that funding be allocated? Will it be allocated on a pro rata basis as regards those who suffered most in the last year or so, or will it be straight across the board?
Okay, thank you very much. Taoiseach.
Yeah, just on the homeless numbers, which are the number of people in emergency accommodation, which are up again, and I agree with Deputy Casey that they're disappointing, but I'm almost loath to use that word, because it's much more than disappointing. It's devastating that they continue to rise. In my view, now the numbers of families and children has gone down slightly. The number of singles has gone up, but overall it's an increase. And if you'd asked me this time last year, I would have hoped that by this time this year we would have seen them start to fall. They've kind of levelled off around 10,000 for a year now, but should be falling by now, and falling much faster. And they're not. Of course, a big part of it is providing more social housing, and we're doing that as quickly as we can, and we'll do more this year and next year. And the other issue is the issue of tenants' rights, and with the cooperation of the opposition parties, we enhanced tenants' rights just in the last couple of weeks, which means that if somebody is given a notice to quit by their landlord, they've much more time now to find alternative accommodation. And I think both those things are going to make a difference in terms of exits from homelessness, and also preventing people from becoming homeless in the first place. So I'd be more than disappointed and more than devastated if by this time last year we don't have those numbers falling substantially. There are factors under our control, like the provision of social housing, like enhancing tenants' rights, there are ones that are not under our control. Nearly half of homelessness is caused by family breakdown. It's impossible to predict how many families will break down in the next year, and then roughly maybe 20% of people who are homeless are not from the EA. They're not entitled to housing, may not even be entitled to live here at all. And again, it's impossible to predict those numbers for the year ahead. What we can predict is a number of additional homes we will add to the social housing stock, and that's going to be at least 10,000 this year, which is quite a big increase from where we were a few years ago. On the compensation package, we actually don't have the terms and conditions yet from the Commission, so I haven't seen them. Maybe Minister Creed has seen them, but so I can't answer that question just yet. But we will need to find Exchequer money to match that. That's the way it works. Don't know where it's going to come from yet, but we will find it, and it'll provide some income support to our farmers, and we'll try to ensure that they're able to apply for those payments and get them as soon as possible. I saw the figures out from Teagasc today on how farm incomes have fell substantially last year because of the bad weather and also other factors. So I think they need it, and we're going to try and get it to farmers as quickly as possible. I'm also conscious of the possibility that Mercosur may be back on the agenda, and you'll be aware of that too. Again, I don't have an update on that yet, but it's very much part of our watching brief.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. We're going to move to our next group now, and that group will be Deputy Butler, Deputy O'Dowd and Deputy Curran. So can I start with Deputy Butler?
Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you, Taoiseach, for the engagement. Meeting our skills needs is vital for Ireland's future. As we approach full employment, it is important to ensure that we have the systems in place. Taoiseach, today the Joint Committee on Business, Enterprise and Innovation launched a report on the role of apprenticeships and work permits. And if I could just flag two issues which you please that you might comment on. Last year we had just under 15,000 apprentices in Ireland, which is very welcome because during the recession apprenticeships fell by 80%. But of those 14,953, only 2% are female, 332. And it's an issue that we certainly have to look at. And one other issue that also we learned, prior to 2016 apprenticeship programmes, the state paid the apprentice during the off-the-job training periods. However, for post-2016 apprentice programmes, the employer continues to pay the apprentice when they are on off-the-job training. So for block release, which is 15 weeks, it can cost the employer $7,500. Whereas if you have somebody on release 1 day a week, it's much easier for the employer to absorb that cost. So I'm just wondering, is it something that we could maybe look at going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy O'Dowd.
Thanks, Seán. I think the biggest issue facing our chairmanships collectively today is the Curran's judgment and how it impacts on us as office holders and on the Oireachtas. While I know it's a matter for all of us individually to deal with, nevertheless I think it would be important that we could get a perspective from your department on it. I feel that the credibility of the Oireachtas is threatened by the finding that we acted unlawfully, or a committee did. So I think it's hugely important for us now to reform ourselves, and I'd appreciate your comments on that. The key to that, and the most important issue in our committee this year, was in fact our hearings into the FAI, and there was over 100,000 people online watched the proceedings, and yet there was an absence of capacity of us to ask particular questions, to follow through on decisions that were made. So there's a huge gap here that we have to address, and I would really appreciate your comments on that.
Thank you. Deputy Curran.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. You're welcome, Taoiseach. In your opening comments, you made reference to the fact that we're nearing full employment and rates of poverty and deprivation are falling, and that's true. But it belies the fact that we still have significant numbers of people who are living in very, very difficult and challenging conditions. We have families who haven't worked in generations, so we've intergenerational unemployment, and we have communities that are still very, very disadvantaged and deprived. And there are a range of programmes across government departments to assist those. We used to have RAPID. Unfortunately, it has now become the Community Enhancement Scheme, and its remit is much broader than targeted disadvantaged areas. Our social inclusion programme, the level of funding is static and is projected to be static for the next number of years. Funding to drug task forces, again, Taoiseach, hasn't increased. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the targeted interventions that these community needs across departments need to be assessed. I'm not saying for one moment that every subhead has to be increased, but what I would ask you to consider is a cabinet subcommittee to look at the areas of disadvantage, because it is across 3 or 4 or 5 maybe government departments, to address it significantly. We have been in this state before where the country is doing well, but we left people behind us, and I wouldn't like to see the same thing happen. I think we can do better than we're doing at the moment. I think we should do better, but it probably needs a cabinet subcommittee to work on it in a cohesive and joined-up way.
Thank you. Thank you. Taoiseach.
Just picking up on Deputy Butler's point around the number of female apprenticeships, I wasn't aware the figure was that low, but I know it is low. I think the Deputy is correct. We need to make a serious effort to interest more girls and women in taking up apprenticeships. We are facing major skill shortages in construction and so many other areas, and we definitely need more women to consider taking up those careers, and they're generally very well paid once you get through your apprenticeship. So I think her point is very well made in that regard. On employers having to pay when the apprentice is on block, I'll check into that. There's always kind of 2 arguments on this one. You know, some people would say that the state is paying for the training for your employees. Like, should you not make a contribution? You know, if the state wasn't providing your training, you'd have to go off and pay for yourselves, like the guilds used to do. On the other hand, employers would no doubt immediately point out to me that they pay both the national training levy and employers' PRSI, and they are paying for it. But I'll check that one out again. And we are increasing employers' PRSI every year we're increasing national training levy every year by 0.1%, which brings in an extra 50 million for higher education and training. On the Cairns judgment, I haven't read it yet, so I'm loath to comment on it. We can certainly provide advice on it from government, but I think now that there is an Office of Parliamentary, the Office of Parliamentary Legal Counsel.
Well, Taoiseach, if you don't mind, the Committee on Procedure and Privilege have actually established a working group on this, and they will be responding to that. There will also be a
point that it's important that we all have an input into that as chairpersons. That's my point. We must be seen to ourselves to act to reform.
Absolutely.
That's my point.
There will be, and there will also be, just to let you know, there will be a briefing prepared for just after the break, which will be available to the chairs in relation to the ruling, and then this working group has been established to allow for input on it. Sorry, Taoiseach.
I think what's definitely required there, Chairman, though, is some sort of clear guidance and clear guidelines for committees and chairs as to what can happen and what can't happen. I know Deputy O'Dowd very ably chaired the hearings into the FAI, and there is huge public interest in that, and it also made change happen. And that does show the power of Oireachtas committees, that you can actually hold people to account and make change happen. At the same time, I have to confess that I do believe that the previous PAC did treat some witnesses very badly a few years ago, and notwithstanding all the issues around Ms Curran's salary, I think she was badly treated in the way she was treated by the previous PAC, and there's one referendum I voted for that I'm glad got defeated, and that was the one that would have given Parliament the power to carry out Oireachtas inquiries and make findings of fact against people. And I voted for that as part of the government that proposed it, and I'm glad the people in their wisdom refused it, because ultimately we are politicians and we need votes to stay in our jobs, and we're driven by news cycles. And if you're going to act in a judicial way and make judgments on individuals, well, then you have to do it in a fair way. You have to listen to all of the evidence. You have to not comment on it until you've heard all the evidence, and then come to your conclusions in a judicious way. That should not in any way affect how the public see you. And I just really think that's one of those areas where the people were right, and we should maintain that separation between the judiciary, who can make findings of fact and findings against individuals, and us as politicians who really probably shouldn't go into that space. But that's not to say that we can't have robust committees that hold organisations to account and shine light into dark places, and you've done that very well, I think, in recent times. On the issue of poverty, which is a very real thing in Ireland and very disadvantaged communities, I think Deputy Curran makes some very valid points, and I know you were a very effective minister in that area, and I remember you working in that role. Long-term unemployment is now down to 1.9%. It's probably as low as it's ever been, but that masks a different reality behind that, which is what we call jobless households, where nobody in the house is in employment. I won't say works, because often people work as carers in the home, but nobody is in paid employment, and we have a specific action plan to deal with that, and that's been driven by Minister Harty, and I think can make a big difference if we can, through a combination of incentives and disincentives, encourage those households to join the workforce, or at least one person in those households to join the workforce. On the community enhancement scheme and Rapid, I do want to have a rethink about that, because I started thinking about it myself the other day. Like, we all know what's been done in the northeast inner city, and how so far, at least, that's been successful. And of course, everybody now would like that model replicated in their area, and we know that's not possible, because you wouldn't be able to find that amount of resources to do it in all areas. And I kind of thought maybe we should designate 10 or 20 areas of profound deprivation around the state and do something similar. And then it kind of occurred to me, did we not do that before, and wasn't it called Rapid? And I was thinking of places like, parts of Deputy O'Dowd's constituency, places like Corduff and Lady Well in my constituency, Rowanstown in yours, and we could all think of a few places, and we would very quickly end up reinventing Rapid again. So I'm giving that some thought, and I'm going to talk to Martin Bettis, who knows a lot about NEC as well, and see if we can relaunch something that would be very targeted for a small number of disadvantaged areas in the country, based on objective criteria. So it's not everyone. Of course, everyone will want their parish in, but that just won't work. So I'm giving that some thought.
And I'm going to go back now to Deputy Butler.
Our committee has heard many engagements on the merits of Ireland joining CERN. The vast majority of EU countries are members of this scientific organisation. There is an economic dividend in being a member of CERN. However, membership is very expensive. 1 million for associate membership and 10 million and more for full membership. My question is, have you given any consideration to this? The general consensus seems to be that if Ireland is serious about being part of the international science community, we ought to be a part of CERN. So just your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you. Deputy O'Dowd.
Thank you. I welcome Taoiseach's comments and support what he said. And just one of the issues that arises in our investigation of bodies that are accountable to us, that they only get a proportion, maybe a minority of their funding is coming from the taxpayer, say through Sports Ireland. And the problem is, while due diligence is done on that amount of money, it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't other issues arising. So I suppose we have to look at this new legislation, if necessary, to, so that if Sport Ireland or bodies like them form an opinion that there may be other issues arising as a result of facts that are brought to their attention, that they would have the capacity and the legal authority to do so, given the strict and appropriate guidelines in that respect.
Thank you. Deputy Curran.
Thank you. Taoiseach, thank you for your comments in relation to rapid and disadvantaged areas. And first of all, I do recognise everybody will want a programme in their area, but there is analysis and figures available to show the areas of greatest deprivation. And I suppose the only comment I would make is it's not necessarily about new programmes and new schemes. It's probably more targeted resources. So our most disadvantaged areas. It's not just rapid funding, it's funding going through the Department of Social Protection for breakfast clubs, it's youth affairs and children. So it's that joined up approach. But like you're doing in the northeast inner city, I think there is greater scope to tackle some of our most disadvantaged areas. And I don't really like naming them because I don't want a stigma attached, but I think the evidence is there to support the areas that would benefit from it most. And if we can't do it when times and the economy is growing, I don't think we'll ever do it properly, and I think this is an opportunity that we should take, and I'm glad to see that you're prepared to look at reintroducing a rapid style, you can call it as you will, a rapid style that will target those resources at our most disadvantaged areas.
Taoiseach.
Thanks. I have to check up on CERN. I know it's kind of come up, and I've often seen online campaigns around encouraging us to join CERN, and I've actually a guy in my class in primary school works in CERN, although I haven't seen him in a long time. I run to his mother around election time regularly, but I haven't seen him in a long time. So I have to check on that. I had a feeling that we did decide to join associate membership, maybe. Yeah.
2016 at a cost of 1 million,
okay.
But the decision then was withdrawn.
And we never did it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have to check with Mr. Halligan on that.
Thanks, Taoiseach.
Yeah, I have a recollection that we did, and
yeah.
I don't know why we didn't then. I just would agree with Deputy Curran that it's as much about joining up what we're doing already as it is about resources. And one of the things we have set aside, and it's in the new contract with GPs, and it's only to get started, is a 2 million fund dedicated to primary care in areas of high disadvantage. And I would see that as a start, and we can scale it up. And there's a thing in healthcare, and Deputy Harty will be very familiar with this, called the inverse care law. Those people who need healthcare the most are the least likely to get it. Sort of wealthy people can afford healthcare and often have a lot of unnecessary investigations and even unnecessary operations, whereas those who often need it the most are the ones who get the least. And the answer to that in education is debt. And we all know how that works, but there's nothing like that in healthcare. So in areas of great disadvantage, where people are more likely to die young, more likely to smoke, more likely to get cancer, more likely to be sick, primary care in those areas gets the exact same funding from the state as it would if it was anywhere else, and that's wrong. And I think if we're doing something like a Rapid 2 or something on those lines, part of it needs to be healthcare, and a very significant increase in healthcare investment in those designated areas, focusing particularly on those things that make the most difference, which would be public health. Encouraging people to turn up for screening, smoking cessation, so many of those things that blight people's health.
Okay, thank you, Taoiseach. We're going to move now to our next grouping. So our next grouping will be Deputy Crowe, Deputy O'Sullivan, and Deputy Farrell. So Deputy Crowe.
Go, Margaret. I suppose the team wants to stick to is just one particular area, but we'd probably do two questions. One is it's the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. It's up and running for the last 20 years. I suppose some of the most difficult meetings that we've done is with families of victims, people of legacy killings and so on. They have come in. I suppose some of the concerns that people have is in relation to delays in inquests, some up to 40 years, information withheld, inquiries agreed but never set up. And I suppose some of the difficulties now that we're facing now is that following the statement from the British Defence Secretary in relation to introduce a statute of limitation for British soldiers, I just wonder, first of all, the Irish government, I know what you've said in relation to you're opposing this, but have you told that the Defence Secretary that an amnesty for British soldiers is unacceptable? Can we also provide an update on legislation the Irish government has to introduce regarding the Stormont House legacy mechanisms? And again, we have an agreement there, Stormont House, to move forward in relation to legacy. And again, we have this situation where British Defence Secretary and the Secretary of State undermining that process forward.
Thank you. Now, Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thank you. Apologies from Deputy Smith. So the first aspect that the committee have been dealing with and had quite a number of meetings recently is on the defence, on the armed forces, and it's pretty much replicating what was brought up at leaders' questions the other day with yourself. So you know the issues there, the pay, the retention, the lack of morale, and I think you acknowledged those issues and you mentioned certain things that were happening. But certainly from the meeting this morning, there is a particular urgency to get into addressing those issues. The second issue I just raised is that the committee did welcome the Business and Human Rights report, which eventually came. There was also a chair appointed, and the question is, when will we see some work from that implementation group? Because again, we're hearing it took a long time to get the policy together. Business and human rights. And it took a while to get a chair, and now it's also taking a while before we hear anything from that particular one. And the last area, the second last area is, Better World was launched. You launched it with the Taoiseach and with Minister Cannon. So the need now is, how do we monitor that? And do we have a mechanism that is going to monitor that? And of course that brings in the whole area of policy coherence, which we're not very good at.
Thank you. Deputy Farrell.
Thank you, Chairperson, and welcome, Taoiseach. The overarching issue that always comes up in the Committee on Children and Youth Affairs is childcare, clearly. One of the big ones, obviously, being launched is the National Childcare Scheme, which is coming very shortly. But there's never enough that we can do in this sphere because we're so far behind where we should be as a state, and notwithstanding the unprecedented budget that's being provided to the Department of Children, one of the meaningful steps that I think we must take, and has come up time and time again both in committee and in the Dáil, is rates. It's a small gesture towards the industry. Some have rates waivers, others do not, dependent upon whether they are purely etchy or some private work as well, if you want to call it that. And then the other clear issue, Chairman, for consideration is some sort of uniform approach to the after-school setup, particularly using the state's assets, the schools up and down the country, to provide after-school care, and some meaningful step in that sphere.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Just starting with Deputy Crowe's question on the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, like the government's position on this is crystal clear. There cannot be a statute of limitations, and there cannot be an amnesty when it comes to crimes that may have been committed by British soldiers in Northern Ireland or any other combatants involved in conflict in Northern Ireland. I know the UK government may intend to apply that in Great Britain, but we will vehemently oppose any attempts to apply it to Northern Ireland. And they know that, and we've said that, and we'll continue to do so. And I think they've heard it, in fairness. And the proposal, as I'm aware of it now, would apply to Great Britain, but not to Northern Ireland, if I'm correct on that. On the legacy arrangements that were agreed in Stormont House, there really hasn't been any progress on that, and that's become tied in with the efforts to re-establish the executive, and talks are now underway among the different parties. Taoiseach is in Belfast today. The Prime Minister is very keen to see the institutions up and running before she leaves office, and I would like that to happen too. So we're going to work very closely together on that, the two governments together, and I hope that all the parties at the talks will be able to make whatever compromises are necessary to get the institutions back up and running, but also in a sustainable way, so that they don't then collapse in a few months' time. And I really think that's essential now, not just because of the sad killing of Lyra McKee, but also because of the dangerous period ahead that we may be entering into around Brexit, and something that I'm very committed to getting going again. I do think we should though welcome the fact that the British government has released additional money for the inquests, and we sought that for a long time, and they've now done that. And you'll know some of those inquests are now underway, particularly in relation to Ballymurphy. Deputy Sullivan asked about the Defence Forces pay, and we are, as I said in the House yesterday, Defence Forces pay is linked to pay in the public service, even though they're not unionised and they're not part of ICTU. They do benefit from any of the national pay agreements that are made, and that means that by October 2020, pay for the vast majority of public servants, including soldiers and Air Corps and Navy, will be fully restored, and that's done in steps. And that's very much underway already. And separate to that, the Public Sector Pay Commission has done a report, which I now have, on issues that are specific to the military, and they made some recommendations, and they'll probably go to Cabinet in about 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time at the latest. But I think there's going to be more to this, though, than pay. There's other issues there when it comes to morale and retention, and we need to look at it in the round, and we're determined to do that. I'm not familiar, I have to admit, with the Business and Human Rights Working Group, so I'll have to check that out and come back to the Deputy. When it comes to Better World, that's a really exciting policy. Expanding what we do in terms of international development around the world. €100 million budget this year. There'll be another increase next year, all things going to plan. I'm not sure how it's monitored, actually. I imagine the Foreign Affairs Committee has some role in monitoring it, but I'll be open to any suggestions in that regard. It's turning into a very big budget. It's €800 million now, so it does need to be monitored and monitored properly. I think Deputy Farrell mentioned the issue of childcare, which I know is an enormous issue for citizens, particularly for young families, and it's a big issue in my constituency, which is a very young constituency, as is yours. And the objectives of government are twinfold. One is to reduce the cost of childcare for parents while increasing the quality, because it isn't just about childcare, it's also early education. And I think we're doing that. And the Deputy mentioned the National Childcare Scheme, which kicks in November. And that'll mean an increase in subsidies for those already in receipt of subsidies, and it'll mean about 10,000 middle-income families who currently qualify for nothing will qualify for subsidies for the first time. But that's not supposed to be the end of it. Once that scheme comes in, it can be expanded and it can be developed, subject to the availability of finance. One of the demographic advantages we have now is that the birth rate has actually been falling for a couple of years now, and that does create opportunities to do more with the same in areas such as childcare, maternity, and primary care and primary education. I'm agnostic on the issue of rate exemptions. The problem, as you know, with rate exemptions is any time you exempt any business, including non-businesses, public buildings and so on, from rates, inevitably that means others pay more. I think you just always have to bear that in mind. You can exempt so many good things, and all of a sudden, it's the tailor and the butcher and the guy in Main Street who then ends up paying much higher rates, and that creates a problem in itself. And my general view on taxation is to have it broad, rather than hitting some people with very high taxes. On after-school care, something I'd really love to see more developed. It seems like such a lost opportunity. We have school buildings all over the country, and why isn't it the norm in our schools to have study hall or after-school activities and so on? And I don't know why it hasn't been developed. I'd be interested in your own thoughts, because it just seems like such a lost opportunity that we have schools. We still have schools that kind of shut down at 3:30, at 4 o'clock, when there's such potential there for after-school activities, and not just study hall, just sports and all sorts of things. And I don't know why we don't do more of that.
Deputy Crowe, your second question.
What was agreed in the past, the St Andrews Agreement, and I suppose one of the issues that's going to, again, for the talks in the future. The Government will introduce an Irish Language Act reflecting on the experience of Wales and Ireland, and work with the incoming executive to enhance and protect the Irish language. That was in the script of the St Andrews Agreement. What is the Irish Government doing to secure an Irish Language Act agreed in the St Andrews Agreement? Again, it's back to this about people making compromises, people agreeing to things, and then no follow-up and no implementation. So I suppose it's what is the Irish Government doing in relation to this?
Deputy O'Sullivan.
Yes, I do think there is a need for a defined, definite framework for the monitoring of a better world, and it would be interesting to get from the department and to see where the role of the Foreign Affairs Committee is in that. But I think central to it has to be policy coherence. We played such a major role in Sustainable Development Goals, but unless our climate policies, our tax policies are also coherent with our ODA policy, there is, you know, it's giving with one hand and taking with the other. And the other issue, of course, that comes to the committee quite a lot, we meet quite a number of human rights defenders, Indigenous peoples or farmers, wherever. Now, some NGOs have very good connections, or they can make a call that can practically save a person's life. And we've had ones recently in Guatemala and Honduras. But it's to have that access to somebody who can make the call to the relevant person when somebody's life is being threatened, and that's being brought to us.
Thank you very much. And your second question.
Thank you, Chairman. Taoiseach, I thank you for your comments. I understand on the rate side it is a complex issue. It is based on several generalities, but based on the number of childcare providers across the state, the best guess is it's a very small sum of money. And while I do appreciate your comments, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs could look at it, but would have to do so through the Department of Housing and obviously the local authorities. So it is something that the department cannot achieve on its own. I acknowledge your remark in relation to the government's twin track approach to improving childcare service providers while trying to assist families. And on that subject of higher standards, the elephant in the room is the rates of pay for those individuals with those higher qualifications still being paid very low wages, and I believe it's something we have to look at in terms of the international market and what they are doing, particularly in the Nordics. My last point, Cathaoirleach, is Minister Daly had a pilot scheme in his constituency that ran for a number of years. I have two after-school school building uses pilot schemes on the run, and there's also several commercial operators in that sphere, but some sort of formal government-led approach or department-led approach really should be looked at. And that same question you asked of yourself, why isn't it being done? Well, it appears it's been rolling for many years, but hasn't actually been grasped.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Thanks. Just in relation to the St Andrews Agreement, if my recollection is correct, is a part of the difficulty with the commitment in the Irish Language Act was that it wasn't in the St Andrews Agreement. It was in a sort of a side agreement between the Taoiseach at the time and the British Prime Minister at the time, and that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been implemented. It's such a shame that it's kind of got caught up in the current dispute about getting institutions back up and running. And it's a shame that people see the Irish language in any way as some sort of threat. You know, there's a Scottish Language Act in Scotland. It doesn't make Scotland any less British, and there's a Welsh Language Act in Wales, and it doesn't make Wales any less British. And it's just a shame that it's got caught up in that whole constitutional question that always divides people in Northern Ireland. But as somebody who loves the language, what I just would like to see is some sort of progress. You know, official recognition for the language, maybe a language commissioner, some other things, and then once you have that, you can build on it. You know, I'm a great believer in the power of incrementalism, and maybe we need an incremental approach to this, so as to reassure people with a British Unionist, loyalist, or Protestant identity that this isn't something to be afraid of. This isn't something that's trying to be pushed on them. And you'll have heard some of the wild stories that have floated around about people being forced to learn Irish, or having to, or quotas for people in the civil service. Like none of those things were ever really proposed, and it's just a shame that that's become part of the narrative north of the border. I think Deputy Sullivan kind of raised the issue of contradictory policies, and I do hear you on that. And when it comes to tax, we have made some really big changes in the last couple of years. I'm not sure whether that's fully appreciated by some of our critics. Getting rid of stateless corporations, getting rid of the double Irish. We're one of the few countries now that fully shares our revenue information with other countries. Like, the only way you can know whether a company isn't paying tax anywhere is if every revenue authority shares that information, and we're one of the ones that do that. And we're now deeply engaged with the OECD on what we're going to do around making sure that big digital companies pay their fair share of tax. and big profitable companies should pay their fair share of tax, and they don't always. But we also need to make sure that whatever reforms we sign up to don't hollow out our own tax base. And there was a view in the past that Ireland was under-taxing corporations. If that was true in the past, it's certainly not true now. The warnings that we get from the Fiscal Advisory Council and others is the opposite, is that you're over-reliant on the money, the massive amounts of money we're now taking in from those corporations. And I think we need to bear that in mind too. And I know sometimes in other areas that there can be apparent contradictions. The fact that we would, through our health and well-being programmes, promote breastfeeding, and then perhaps through our other agencies promote baby milk, and those contradictions aren't lost to me. They just might take a bit of time to unwind. On childcare, Deputy Farrell mentioned the issues around rates of pay and how that's linked to quality. I think he's correct in that regard. At the same time, we also need to bear in mind how higher rates of pay will impact on costs for parents. I'd say in the medium term, what will happen is some form of sectoral employment order for the sector. Now, it's not heavily unionised at present, but if it were to become more unionised, I imagine there would be then a case for a sectoral employment order there to set a minimum pay standards across the sector.
We are now going to have, unless we're joined by anybody, we're going to have our final grouping. So that will be Deputy Connolly and Deputy O'Snellig. I'm going to put you into that group as well. Deputy Connolly.
Garmin mag the Healy-Rae agus a hishi falter roth agus a zinto gwil magic chocolate kale sa shomer shaw archi yen and a custa na gwelga na gweltocht agus na nilla na kwijivra so sa cohection tá gá pránach le bilina changa ga efficula a ailshu an bhfuil dáta agan céanúra ailseofer é ifar a dó hí costa stúra le bunú faoin plan gníomhaíochta chun manatóireachta a dhéanamh an stratas fiche bliain cáhfuil an costa stúra sin agus ifar a trí policy done in Ilan. Tá aspa policy done in Ilan. So Taoiseach, three things. One is, where is the official languages bill? Okay, to intok agus cógáirdegus as up dan éachta tá genta agad ó híomh na gcuinge.
Tá brónagum gwyl an fragra asperla.
Deputy O'Snellig.
Three cash can one. Cash Hannah Fame. The other two relate to a major programme, international programme, Gailliv Fihe. Carey came in what steps are you taking? Is there an intention to increase the funding for it, and will you meet with the directors of Galway 2020 to kind of help them to gain the publicity that they need so that they can attract sponsors to have as big a range of activities as possible? In terms of two pieces of legislation that's promised in the area that comes under my committee, I was asked to raise was the Heritage Bill and National Monuments Bill. When do you expect us to get them in committee so that we can? It's a big job of work. And finally, just the question is, the committee, and it's probably the same with other committees, is struggling in terms of membership and turnout. And some of that is due to positions not being filled by the government parties or not government members not turning up. And it is one of the problems we have as committees is it can be quite insulting for people who travel to attend our committee where you have one or two members of the committee in attendance. Now, we're all very busy, so I'm not laying the blame at any one person, but it is a difficulty that we have to address as a Parliament, and at the very least all the positions should be filled.
Taoiseach, can I just take the opportunity to since it is the last grouping, to just put a couple of questions to you, particularly, I suppose, Deputy Hildegarde Naughton mentioned to me the all-government plan on climate action going before Cabinet. When is it likely to be published? And particularly her absence today is due to her attendance at an Internet Regulatory Conference. The Online Safety Commissioner, the legislation on that, when is that proceeding? So just if you could address them as well. So.
Just the questions for Deputy Connolly, Arish Tobroner, Gemeg na Keshna, Gemeg na Gefragroi me Osperla. You'll get a much more coherent answer from me in English, unfortunately, but I'm slowly working on it. I'll have to check again on the publication dates for the Official Language Act and the Implementation Action Plan. They've both been pending for quite a while, and I know you're raising them very regularly in the Chamber, so you're probably wondering why I'm not giving you a date once again, but I will pursue them with the Minister. One of the things I hope to do actually in the next 2 months is to have a cabinet meeting in a Gaeltacht area. We've done a number around the country in different provinces. We haven't yet had one in a Gaeltacht area, so perhaps that would be the opportune moment for us to have that work done. And I won't promise that the meeting will be Lawn Tree Gaelga, but we'll have it in a Gaeltacht area, and that might be a good deadline to focus the mind on those two projects. On island policy, I think we really should have an island policy. We kind of have scraps of it around the place. I did a bit of work as Minister of Health on island health, and there are special provisions there in education that you'll be aware of, but it's not all pulled together. And I think that's a very good suggestion that I'll take on as head of government, being able to pull together different departments in that regard. On Galway 2020, it's not something that's being led by central government, as you'll know. I have met them already, but there's been a change in personnel since the last time I had a formal meeting in their offices, and met them informally on Shop Street while I was doing a canvass with MEP Ria Walsh a couple of weeks ago, and I did commit that I'd meet them again, and I will. I think it is a huge opportunity for the city. And one thing that actually does strike me about Galway, and I didn't realise it until quite recently, is that even though it's a great city from a cultural point of view, there really aren't many spaces where you can hold events, and one of the reasons why I think the Connacht Rugby project is so exciting, because it's not just about a rugby stadium. It will have in it facilities for events as well, and that's a very, very exciting project, and I hope that Minister Ross will be in a position to provide it some funding later in the year. On the Heritage Bill, we'll have to come back to you on that as well. On attendance by committee members, I know it is difficult. There are a lot of committees, and we're all very stretched, and then particularly government backbenchers are particularly stretched, because a lot of them are on 3 committees, and then we're giving out to them for not being present for votes and being in the chamber as well. The solution probably is more parties in government, maybe, or a wider range of TDs in government. We'll muddle on for now, anyway. In terms of climate policy, Deputy Bruton, or Minister Bruton, will bring that policy to us in the middle of June. So it's almost done. It's shaping up really well. I know for some people it'll be too little, too late. But what we're trying to do as a government is to get it right when it comes to climate policy. To have a climate policy that is serious, but is also sensible. So serious in the sense that it actually gets our greenhouse emissions down. That's the whole point of it. But sensible in that it doesn't do it in such a way that makes us poorer, or costs us jobs, or makes us less secure. And that's the overriding, I think, philosophy around it. But that's the middle of June. And then more importantly, then implementing it is what we need to do. The Online Safety Commissioner, that's legislation that's being prepared. So I don't know when the date is yet, but I'd expect we'll heads this year.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much, Taoiseach. Thank you for the engagement. Sorry. I'm ahead of myself. You all have a second question to Deputy Connolly and to Deputy O'Dowd.
Especially behind to go away earlier, just in my 2 moments.
My apologies.
Curran fáilte ribh de regra module policy don na Hillan a hí sé tá sin is ru dearfacé sin ach níl sé sásúil beag na mór agus ní féidir glacu leis freigra nach bhfuil dáta agad fós module leis an mille. Bhí an Commissioner Changa os ar cuasa seomra seo caiicí seo hin agus chuir sé anúil có deacaras atá sé dóibh a cuid oibre dhéanamh. He told us how difficult it was to do his work, the Commissioner Chonga, without an Official Languages Act. We have one which is not fit for purposes. It's there since 2003. We've been promised it repeatedly. Before the summer, after the summer, before the Christmas, on Thin Watun Arina Misha. The only mistake I made was I forgot to ask which year. And so we were told this year, then we were told Brexit, and now we're here. He cannot do his work. We're talking about the most basic rights, just bun ceartana. So it's intukawiltu, erinchanagat, cuairte hort an Gaeltacht. I have been to all of the Gaeltachts with the committee, and I can tell you that's the common theme. Please publish the bill so that we can have an act, so we can have basic rights, basic rights. And finally, just in relation to the Costa, we have a strategy 20 years, it's very good. We have a plan Gníomhaíochta, it's very good. But we have to implement it. And so the implementation is dependent on a monitoring body. It hasn't even been set up. So, thank
you. If you're... Yep, okay. Well, then I am going to just change it slightly because Senator Richmond has joined us, and I know you made an extra effort to get to us. So we were literally about to conclude. But Senator Richmond, if you have a couple of questions for the Taoiseach, we'll let the Taoiseach come.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have two questions, Taoiseach, and pertinent to my committee. I have literally just come from a flight in from London, so you can guess how topical they'll be. The first is in relation to. We're about to reopen our public hearings based on the report we published in June 17. And I suppose my question is, in relation to the Brexit preparedness undertaken, not necessarily from a legislative side of things, because obviously the Brexit Omnibus Bill has gone through the Houses and it's very detailed, and not necessarily in relation to a no deal, but working with the various sectors, the business community, the agriculture community, Irish citizens in the north and everything else. Have you set down your department any matrix about what the level of engagement should be, how the various sectors have prepared, have they, put their plans in together, and where do you think we're at that stage? And my second question relates to your meeting this morning with the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. I noticed on some of the media outlets that he said that if he was to become Prime Minister, much like many of the people seeking to become Prime Minister across the aisle, that he'd somehow renegotiate the deal. And I just want to know if you could confirm that you reassured him that the withdrawal agreement has been negotiated, has been closed, and that is the only way to have a managed Brexit that leads us into the future negotiations. Thanks a million, Chairman. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Senator. Taoiseach.
Just to Deputy Connolly, I know almost every week you stand up in the Dáil and you ask when this legislation is going to be published, and each time you do I get a little bit more embarrassed that we haven't published it yet, and that we keep telling you it's imminent when it doesn't arrive. I don't know if it's achievable or not, but I will set that Cabinet meeting as the target date for doing it, because we should do something Gaeltacht related there as well. So let me act on that. To Deputy Richmond, just in relation to Brexit preparedness, we do have stats as to which, how prepared businesses are and so on, and we have a kind of a matrix, the kind of red, amber, green matrix of what's done and what's not, and what's in planning, and we're in pretty good shape in terms of being prepared for no deal. But that's not to diminish in any way the seriousness of it and the impact that it's going to have. But our preparedness is good. Had a very, very good meeting with Mr. Corbyn today and his team. Met one-to-one, and we met as a group and talked about a lot of issues, Northern Ireland and also as well Brexit. And I very much emphasised to him that the withdrawal agreement is closed, and any sort of change to the political declaration, for example, is possible, but the withdrawal agreement itself is closed. And the only way that could ever change would be if there was a fundamental change in red lines from the next UK Prime Minister or the next UK government. For example, a decision to stay in the customs union or the single market. And I think that was well understood by him. And we also talked about how hard it would be to secure any further extension beyond 31st of October. There is a hardening view across the European Union that we can't continue to have rolling extensions. And while there could potentially be a further extension if there was an election, in order to have that election to happen, or if there was a second referendum, I don't think it's viable to believe that there would be sufficient support or unanimous support, that's what's required around the European Council for a further extension while the United Kingdom continues to figure it out, or for another set of indicative votes. So, you know, very much imparted that message as politely as I could, that the chances of a further extension are pretty slim, and the withdrawal agreement, including the Irish protocol and the backstop, is closed from our point of view.
Okay. Well, at this time I'm not ahead of myself, so I would like to thank the Taoiseach and to thank all the committee chairs for the engagement today. It was very comprehensive. I think we covered an awful lot of ground. It is welcome that this is now part of our parliamentary calendar. It gives us an excellent opportunity to allow for that engagement. We look forward to the next engagement with you and with the working group. The committee will now stand adjourned. Sine Dia.